The joke at home is that is the book going to sell or will it go to the Raddiwala? Um, well, I didn't write it to for it to sell as such. Let me very briefly talk about um, why I wrote this book, how it was written, and what its purpose is. And I think later in a conversation with Vikram, some of the details would come out. But first, I'm very happy to be here on this side, normally sitting there listening to speakers. I think it's the first time I'm standing here. Once I was in conversation with Ram Guha, but that was in the hall, and there's a much nicer place under the trees. And the view from here, believe me, is as nice as from the other side. Okay, where and when did this book start? You know, in a way, it started on November 8th when demonetization was announced. Like all of you, I'm sure, I was bewildered. I mean, nobody knew this was coming, of course. Nobody knew what it was about, and nobody knew what was hitting them. So, in fact, that day I was traveling to Bangalore and I drew some 7,500 rupees from an ATM, and I got onto the flight, and then they said that, look, this has been announced. And then when I reached Bangalore, I was in a panic. How do I get home? That cash is of no use. You know, my credit card is not linked to Uber or Ola. Anyway, I got home. But the thing is that in a sense that this was, I don't think any economist knew, of course, nobody knew it was coming. And very few economists also knew what it was about. So soon after that, I started a conversation, the benefit of the former governor of the Reserve Bank, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, who lives in Hyderabad. So I was often in conversation with him. Unfortunately, Dr. Reddy was not able to be here today. He's in Delhi. But we started talking about it. You know, I started asking him, because he was more experienced, obviously, on this. What is it about? What's the purpose? What is the objective? And then we found that we had two very widely different perspectives. We were arguing with each other very differently, and not across each other, but very different perspectives. And then at one point he said, look, why don't we do something about this? You know, why don't you write a book about it? And, why don't you write a book about it? So I said, okay, but provided we can work together. And that, in a sense, is the origin of this book. Conversations with Dr. Reddy about this and differences of opinion. And we began by wondering what the title should be, and he said, look, why don't you write it pros and cons of demonetization? Then he even mischievously said, why don't you write demonetization left and right? So I actually told him that, look, I'm not as left as you think I am, and I don't think you are as right as you think you are. Anyway, we worked on it for a month or so. Then, it was taking time, and he had other commitments. So he said, look, I have to complete those commitments. Why don't you go ahead? So in a sense, that is the origin of this book, how it came about. And as I keep joking, here we were two retired persons sitting in Hyderabad looking for something to do. And demonetization became an opportunity to write a book. Now, the book itself is, it's an outcome of a process of learning, learning about demonetization. I mean, there have been very few global experiences about demonetization, so we didn't really know what it was about. And it's about black money as well, and even black money, it's the very nature of black money that you don't have much information. You don't know how it really functions. You don't really know how much there is around us. So it is, for me at least, it was a process of learning, and as learnt about it, I started putting things down. And the objective was really to explain it, and started by saying that, look, how would I explain this to a layperson? Okay, I'm an economist, I'm a journalist, okay, but how would I put it in simple terms, and how would you explain the issues? Explain the issues, put the facts down, And you see, at that time, as you would recall, the first 2-3 months, there was a flowering of not just news, but analysis on TV, in the newspapers, on the net, on demonetization. That there were a lot of people who were expressing their views. Some was very interesting, some was not so interesting, but a whole range of issues were covered. But I felt that even as that was very interesting and rich analysis, they were often disconnected. There was not connection between issues, and some things were left out. So really this book is an attempt to explain concepts, put issues down, and put the linkages together, and to give it to a general reader in the hope that she will be able to understand. And I think as you heard Ajay's kind words and a couple of others have said, that it is, I think I've somewhere succeeded. Here and there one has to make a little bit of effort. There is no jargon at all. I have not used the economist jargon. There's not a single piece of algebra. There is not a single equation in the book. So, and I have even kept footnotes and endnotes to the minimum. And I have been very easy on the adjectives. I've hardly used the adjective to kind of express opinion. So it's not that I don't have an opinion, but it's there for you to read and come to a conclusion. Now, the book has actually 16 chapters. They are short chapters. It's a short book. There are 4 main strands in the book. One is, question is, if you want to root out black money, is demonetization the most effective way to do so? Second, if you wanted to go ahead with demonetization, then were there other and less disruptive ways to do it than what we experienced in those 2 months? The third is, now that demonetization has been completed, do we see any of the objectives that were outlined in the beginning have been fulfilled? And finally, what next? Is it all over now, or is there something to follow in the months ahead? In fact, the last chapter is titled What Next? Now, these are the 4 main strands, but there are other, not subsidiary strands, but there are other strands as well. One, I explain what black money is, try and explain what it is and how it actually mixes with white money. I also spend a little bit of time talking about, at that time everybody was talking about black money, I was talking about cash. Cash as, where black money was held. Now, I've discussed a little bit, but how within the banking system, within the financial sector, there is a lot of black money being created and circulated, which may today be even more than the cash, what is held in cash. Okay, I argue that on the basis of government committees and documents which have looked at this financial sector. So there's a bit of discussion on that. Then there is also the big issue of digitalization. There is a chapter on digitalization where I have an opinion, and if you read carefully, you will see what my opinion is. But I put the facts before the reader about the state of infrastructure for digitalization, what digitalization can do, what it can't do, how far we are from digitalization, and what the costs and benefits of digitalization are. Basically, my view is that compulsion doesn't really work, and there are many other things. I mean, I talk about the infrastructure, how the infrastructure is not quite ready for such a process. Also, digitalization is not something new. This was a process that has been going on for the past 10 years. And in fact, an interesting statistic that emerged when doing the research for the book was last year or year before last, transactions digitally exceeded those by check. You see, that was already happening, but at an institutional level. Third, an important chapter. You see, one thing is, we are often critical of the press, and I'm not saying this because I'm from the press. I'm as critical as many of you are. But I think those 2-3 months, we saw the Indian media, at least the English language media, which I'm familiar with, both print and on the net, do its job, because reporters went all over the country, went into the interiors, tried to understand how people were coping, how they were not able to cope, how they were adjusting. So there is a huge amount of literature out there, which I have drawn on and compile to give you an idea of the different kinds of impacts on people, not just on jobs and incomes, but, how they dealt. There's one interesting thing that, some of you would have seen. Women who from households with abusive husbands, or, basically women who had to take care of the household, often they carefully, every month they put away a little bit of money, okay? And over the years, there was a fairly large amount that had been accumulated, and much of it was in 500 and 1,000 rupee notes. And that was hidden from the husband or from the brother or the son. And suddenly, not only was it worthless, it was out in the open, So, I mean, things like that I have tried to put before you as impact on the people. Two other issues which I feel were not talked about much. One was about politics. That the link between actually politics and business, how so much of black money is generated there, and how so much of it is used there. I'm not talking about elections. Actually, between, there is a lot of politicians now in business. Don't we know that in this state, both at today's state and the undivided state? And there are a lot of business people who are now entering politics. So this interface between the two there is a lot of generation of black money, which nobody was talking about. The government, of course, didn't talk about it at that time. And even in the media, there wasn't much discussion. So I go into that a little bit. Besides that, there are issues like, the impact on the Reserve Bank of India, on banking, gold and black money, etc. So as you can see, I've tried to cover a whole range of issues. It's a kind of bird's eye view. There is data. I mean, there has been no primary research that has been done. It's all secondary research. What was there in the media, what is in the government reports, and kind of thinking through discussions with Dr. Reddy, discussions with people Dr. Reddy introduced me to. So broadly, I have tried to cover this whole range in about 16 chapters, the impact of demonetization, both direct and indirect. This book was finished in early mid-February. Before, two things happened. One, of course, the statistics came out about the growth of the economy, GDP growth figures, which showed that demonetization had no impact at all. Just a few minutes on that without getting technical. If you look at those figures a little closely, two things, you will find that actually there has been some impact, but not as much as feared earlier. Second, the state of our statistics is not good enough to capture the impact on the informal sector. The biggest impact of demonetization was on the informal sector. The pavement dwellers, the people who in the market who are selling and buying food, those who are self-employed, the agriculturalists, etc. They were the ones who were most impacted, and our statistical machinery cannot capture that immediately. So we are more or less actually told by the Central Statistics Office that over time you should expect a certain revision and to see that GDP growth was not as positive as made out to be in those figures. The second, of course, politics. There's no, the book, well, you may consider it a hole in the book, but it doesn't look at the politics of it at all, I steer clear of that, partly because that's not my field of competence. Second, there was a lot of speculation about it. In the introductory chapter, I kind of skirt the surface. And of course, the book was written before the UP elections, okay? So suddenly after UP elections, you ask yourself, what is it? I mean, people don't care at all, or they didn't mind at all. It's not covered in the book. Maybe we'll bring it up in the discussion. I'll just say that there are two questions to think about in that respect. One is, we know the answer to that. Did demonetization strengthen or weaken the Narendra Modi government? We know the answer to that. The second is separate, and I think we shouldn't link up the two. Was it a correct economic policy decision? There, I think that's what the book tries to address. And linked to this are two other questions, for me slightly more troubling questions. One was it mainly a political gamble? Okay. Or was it an economic policy decision that carried a political risk? The two are different. They're not same. Was it mainly a political gamble? If the answer is yes, then I think there's something that we need to think about a bit. Maybe it can come up in the discussion. as I said, politics is not covered in the book. It's mainly about black money and demonetization. Politics, of course, has to come in. It's sort of there in the chapters. And as I said, there is one chapter on the generation of black money. And to conclude, before I sit down for interrogation by Vikram, I'll just say that it was a major decision, very major decision, taken secretly, And I argue in the book that it need not have been done secretly, and it is a decision taken secretly and which has had a major short-term impact. Now, we don't know as yet, and that's here you are, I'm giving you an opinion while the book gives you the facts and the issues. We don't know as yet whether it will have a beneficial impact on the economy, okay, whatever the government may say, whatever may be claimed. As of now, you look at what's in front of you. We don't know whether there will be a major beneficial impact. If so, then why was it done? Okay, why was it carried out? Now, that's how I end the book, really, what next and, why. And I hope those of you who will get a chance to go through the book will find it useful. And as I said, it's not written for the economist, it is not written for the official. Of course, I hope some officials read it. It is really written for those who want to understand. The word I heard, like this evening, I heard a few people say so, and it's a word I've used in the book, bewildering. I think that's the best word to describe that decision, that it was a bewildering decision. And, what is it about? What is its short-term impact? What is its likely long-term impact? Those are and what are the things that were not addressed, in this decision on demonetization? Those are the issues that are covered in the book, and I hope we've done it. Of course, it was done quickly, but I don't think superficial. I don't think, at least the author doesn't think it is superficial. We've gone into it a fair amount of depth. As I said, if you're retired and you have nothing else to do, you have all the time in the world to do research and write a book. So I hope those of you who read it will find it interesting, and I'll wait for the questions both from the Vikram and from the audience. Thank you.
But as Oscar Wilde said, that every story must have a beginning, middle, and an end, though not necessarily in the same order. I will read out a small passage in the last paragraph of this book, and you will get an insight of what Ram wanted to say. Ending black money calls for larger change in governance, practices, attitudes, and habits. These are changes that must be made not merely in the arms of the state, but also within the larger society. He goes on to add, it is now acceptable for business to operate the levers of political power to get things done. It is now acceptable for political parties and political agents to abuse their office for the smallest of gains to the biggest of payoffs. It is now acceptable for professional associations to condone violations of the norms of professional behavior. It is now acceptable for the more powerful of citizens to proudly state that they flout rules, possess wealth beyond their means, and evade payment of taxes. It matters nothing that they flaunt ill-gotten wealth. Root and branch overhaul in the society is then required to defeat black money. I think a book could not have ended more powerfully than what you said. I will begin by going through what Dr. Reddy said in his foreword. And he asks many questions in his foreword, but I want to ask the first question in a different form. Markets, first many of us have been assuming that markets are bad or unfair, and so the state government should perform the functions. But we have realized that state government can also fail as a state failure. The state should certainly give priority to those activities which the private sector cannot provide. I have a different take on this. Eliminating counterfeit currency, rooting out black money is a function of the state. Why should we as citizens sacrifice for the state what the state failed to do?
Okay, I'm not going to duck the question by saying that that wasn't written by me. You know, it was written in the forward. But I will answer that, you know, as I understand what Dr. Reddy was trying to say. First is that there he is not talking about this per se. He is not talking about demonetization per se. But he is clearly talking about a larger scenario where, you know, what I mentioned in the last paragraph, there is this deep-rooted corruption, you know, economic, moral, and political corruption running through various layers of society. How do you deal with it? And there, it's not something that the government alone can address, you know. So it has to be done both by government and society. And where the economic issues are involved, there is a role for both the state and the market, you know. So there he's really talking about a larger issue. But taking off from your question, you know, this is not a term that I used in the book, but you know, subsequently it came to my mind that really to trap 1% of the population, whether 1% or 2% or whoever, you know, I mean, that however large that number, it's actually a small number who deal with black money, who generate black money. This decision carpet bombed the remaining 99% as well, you know. So there your question becomes very relevant that was that the right thing to do to catch 1%? And even there, I argue that this is not the way to trap them. You are making everybody pay, you know. So was that the right thing to do? And there, from there, various other questions arise that did you do it as an economic decision or did you do it for some political reason?
I would shift to page 62 of your book, and I'm going to ask you a different question. You see, from the point of view of the government also needs some symbolic gestures to tackle black money. So you say attacking cash may be the most effective way of communicating the government's determination to deal with black money. So any attempt to disable its use may send the appropriate signals to the holder of unaccounted wealth and to the people at large. So are you saying that demonetization, we are not worried about the long-term effect, but this symbolic gesture was necessary? In democracy, you also work on symbols, on standing for national anthem and things like that. So is it such a symbol that the government is trying to convey that, you know, this is a strong message it's going to convey? We don't worry about the consequential effects, but this is a symbolic gesture.
I'll answer that in a slightly expansive manner. One is that statement, yeah, I remember that. And that was a statement where, in a discussion, where I talk about the pros and cons of demonetization as an instrument to deal with black money. So I basically argue that most of black money is not held in the form of cash. You know, so demonetization is not going to do much there. But the sentence that you read out, that there may be a symbolic value. If you're dealing with, if you attack cash, it will send a certain message. Having said that, talking about symbolic, you see, now let's come to the politics of it. You know, as I said, you remember when when I ended my talk, I posed 2 questions. That is what worries me, you know, that here was a government that until then was being taunted as a suit boot sarkar. And here was a government that was until then being taunted, saying that, look, where is that 15 lakhs or 1.5 lakhs that you were supposed to put in our accounts? So then the government does this and portrays it as a war against the rich and the corrupt, you know. and it portrays it in that manner, and that narrative is accepted by many people. It is accepted by people who are most affected as well, negatively affected. So, in a sense, that symbolism worked, worked politically. But I'm asking whether, is that what politics is about? I mean, if you wanted to do it symbolic, and let me come back to the more mundane. There is a discussion in the book that, look, I argue that demonetization may not be the most appropriate thing to deal with black money. But if you want to deal with, you want to use demonetization, you could have done it differently. You could have done it in a manner that it did not hurt people. And I give 2-3 options. That it doesn't hurt people, and could have done it, which would have yet had a symbolic impact, but which would have spared, people who were affected those 2-3 months, and would have avoided the dislocation.
You mentioned in your speech also just now, and you also referred to the book on the design flaws in the implementation of demonetization. And you just mentioned here that maybe secrecy was not needed. Was secrecy a design flaw?
Yeah, the most charitable explanation is that it's a design flaw. The less charitable explanation is that, there's a lot of things to be, you do something with a tamak, it has a huge impact, and, so yes, certainly it was a design flaw, although the justification is, I think I should explain that. The justification for secrecy is that if word had got round, then people who had black money would have found ways of converting it to this or that, or taken it here, there, everywhere, My argument is that you did it secretly, and yet in the end, we don't know really, you probably asked me that question. Most of the people with illegal cash found a way to convert it and put it into the banking system. So you must have known that this was going to happen, and yet you went ahead with that secret approach.
Yeah, I mean, actually loosely said, this is the largest conversion after Khilji invaded India. But did the government underestimate the large-scale corruption in Reserve Bank, in banks, amongst businessmen, and they didn't expect this. That forget the demonetization process, all of us have participated in this conversion process. I have said it in another meeting. 8:30 he announces demonetization. All over the country by 9:15 we are in jewelry shops. So if it had been a little more a democratic process, they would have found out this design flaw. But did the government underestimate how corrupt we are?
Yeah, Vikram, there I would disagree. I mean, it's not we, I think a very small proportion of population, those who had cash to dispose of, they were the ones who, beat the system.
I mean that.
think, yeah. I mean, I'm talking about that 1%, I'm not.
I admit I didn't see you in the jewelry shop.
I was there trying to catch a taxi to go. Anyway, no. No, I mean, let me take that question and turn it around a bit, actually. See, that was one, they probably didn't see it, that between 9 and 12 o'clock, people will go and buy gold, jewelry, iPhones, etc. But they probably also knew that, you see, look at this. Within 2-3 weeks of demonetization, the government announces an amnesty scheme, the second amnesty scheme of the year. I think the demands placed on them were extraordinary. But let me answer your question slightly differently. You see, we did some calculations about what the capacity of the currency presses are, how much they could produce in one shift, in 2 shifts, and then you have the amount of currency that was taken out. Those numbers are there in the book. Again, they're there without adjectives, without opinion. But they show you that there is simply no way a government official or an RBI official would not have known
that it would have been impossible to replace even a fraction of that currency within a few weeks. So what I'm saying is that a government that took this decision knew that there was going to be a major dislocation, okay? And yet it went ahead with that decision. Why? I mean, you can have dark explanations for this. I don't buy I mean, some things were incompetence, that the ATM not being able to handle the 2000 rupee note, etc. But the larger thing, it stares you in the face that you would not have been able to replace that currency. Therefore, you would have known that people would have been affected, and you knew which sections of the population were going to be affected. And yet you went ahead with that decision.
You examine other options of how this demonetization could have been achieved. And I recommend all of you read that chapter, because we have other alternatives for the same objective. But I want to ask you, if secrecy was an objective, don't you think that a shorter time period instead of 50 days would have made us, would have achieved the objective, because then we would have had less time to convert? And why didn't they think of that?
Vikram, the crooks in our society will find any system. I mean, the fact that they
That's very reassuring.
3 lakh crore, at least 3 to 4 lakh crore rupees they converted. Shorter time period, I think, would have caused more dislocation, because don't forget that it is not only, the time period was not only to destroy illegal money, but it was also to allow people like you and me to go and exchange what we legally had, So if you had a shorter period, the dislocation, I think, would have been even more.
Would have been more.
Yeah.
That's what I think. The last question on this line, I would say, is that the printing of this 2000 rupee note, do you think it's a professional error that the size was not thought through, whether there is demonetization or not? Why inflict that change on the lakhs of ATMs in this country, and on top of it you demonetize?
You can only guess, but I think this is the case of, when you keep decision making to a small group, the errors like this are likely to happen. I think that was one of those. But we do know now that for some years, the RBI has been asking for introduction of newer and higher currency, because they said that, look, 500 rupee note is become now an everyday kind of currency. So therefore, you must actually, they had a proposal to, I think, have a 5,000 rupee and even 10,000 rupee, which was, so I think as part of that process, they must have designed this, I think. And then when they were asked to rush through, nobody put 1 and 3 together and realized that there was going to be this problem.
But tell us, because you've got an interesting analysis in this book on how the high denomination notes went up in the last 15 years. In the beginning of 2001, it was 26.7%, and now it is 87.5%. And you analyze saying that based on the per capita GDP, the per capita incomes have gone up. But still, I have not convinced the way you have argued that this 87.5% was necessary. Is there something else which we need to understand in this?
Necessary, was it necessary to demonetize it?
No,
or
it
was
is not necessary to increase the proportion of high HDN notes as a total notes in circulation.
Okay. You see, okay, let me try and explain it to the audience. You see, one of the arguments made for demonetizing the 500 rupee and 1000 rupee note was that these were high value notes. So therefore, they were not used every day. They were used only by those who, entering into illegal transactions, etc. So I've done a simple analysis, actually picking up from an analysis that had already appeared. I have compared our per capita income last year with the value of this 500 rupee, 1000 rupee note. And I find that ratio is very small. And I also, last time we had a demonetization was in 1978, when I think 5,000 and 10,000 rupee notes were demonetized. And I compare the per capita income at that time with the value of the currencies which are demonetized then, and find that at that time the ratio is very high, which suggests that at that time, those notes were really not part of everyday use. While today, those notes that were demonetized, especially the 500 rupee note, would have entered into everyday transactions. Now, the interesting thing is that in February, when the economic survey was published, they have done the same analysis, but they have done it for over 20 years. And come to the same conclusion that these notes, you cannot say, I mean, being the government's economic survey, they don't say it so strongly, but they were really part of everyday transactions, especially the 500 rupee note. Because remember, Vikram, you're saying from 2000, but late 2000, inflation was so high. You know, when the 500 rupee note was there in the 80s, 90s, it was of high value. But over time, it became much like the 100 rupee note. While the 1000 rupee note, you can say to some extent it was of high value. You can't say that of the 500 rupee note. And which is why I mentioned that the RBI, recognizing this, had made suggestions for introducing 2000 and 5000 rupee currency notes.
But how do you explain the fact that the large number of 2000 rupee notes were found 5 days after demonetization? Is it once again a corrupt somewhere?
Yeah, clearly, it's our system in full bloom. I mean, those who are able to put their illegal wealth into the banks also found a way to get it out and beat the ceilings. But
Okay. I shift to another very interesting chapter on black money and politics. And you quote the Prime Minister on his 31st December speech, where you say political parties, political leaders, and electoral funding figure prominently in any debate on corruption and black money. The Prime Minister himself made a brave departure, and he directly attacked the issue, saying that there is a lot of black money in political funding. So what they attempted to rectify is the funding of the political party. But I must say this, that you also make an interesting statement, and I like for that. You said that, being in public office or in a position to participate in parliamentary debates enhances the scope for generating black money. Are you saying that even for asking a question there is corruption? Is it what you are saying?
it's very well known that, there was a cash for questions controversy about
Yeah,
5-10 years ago.
6 MPs
That
got
was about. But that is not, you see, the big thing is actually when you're in the parliamentary committees in the business in your area. I mean, everybody talks about Vijay Mallya being in the Civil Aviation Parliamentary Committee. But the problem with Vijay Mallya is that, he was, he always liked to advertise himself. He was so loud. But there are so many MPs who lobby to get into parliamentary committees where they have business interests. Because it's in the parliamentary committees that, the draft legislation is modified, it is corrected, etc. And it is in the parliamentary committees that suggestions are made for new laws, etc. So it's a big area of corruption.
So, in fact, but the question I have here is: are you saying that businessmen should not enter politics?
No, not at all. We have a history. Our independence movement saw so many business persons in politics. But what I'm trying to say is that you must have clear rules on dividing conflict of interest. You can't have Vijay Mallya sitting in the Civil Aviation Committee. You can't have Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who has defense interests, sitting in the Defense Committee. You can't have, there is a very big BD magnate from UP, who's sitting in the Tobacco Subsidy Rules Committee. So there is no such thing as a conflict of interest, And I think, unfortunately, I think we've gone beyond drawing those rules, making up those rules, because that is what politics is now. I mean, that chapter there about politics in business is trying to say that, look, politics is now a kind of business enterprise, People are entering politics because, there are empires to be built through politics. And similarly, there are politicians entering business because they're using their positions.
I also like what you say here. You say that in the context of black money and politics, the line between party funds and personal funds of the leadership is often thin. Uh, in the debate which we conduct in public, we always talk about the role of black money and the role of political parties in the black money. We don't talk about the funds, personal funds of the political leadership, which I think is at least about 15 to 20 times more than the party money. So don't you think that the debate must be widened to talk about personal corruption in politics and the role of black money in that?
Yes, I think we have to, because that is what is happening, other than perhaps the BJP, there are many other parties which have really become family parties, both small and large, other than the BJP and the communist parties. They are all family parties where money is collected or made supposedly for the party, which itself illegal, but a lot of it is used by the leaders of the party. I mean, as I said, we have personal experience here in the state, of this happening. So how are we going to address that, The people who are supposed to make laws to correct that are themselves participating in this, So in a sense, we are in a blind alley, So I flag the issue, as it were, that this is a major thing, that it is really not political party alone, but those who run these political parties, they are.
No, because you also say, and I think you've not supported this, but you say that a much larger number of registered political parties are not contesting elections, but are enjoying the tax benefits that come from being registered with the Election Commission. One analysis of the situation in 2014 noted that of the 1646 parties registered with the ECI, 404 contested in the 2014 parliamentary elections. That left as many as 1,182 political parties that were dormant, but yet claimed the tax benefits. What are these tax benefits you're talking about, and how much money laundering has happened? Do we have any data on that?
The tax benefits that a political party gets is that it's exempt as long as it presents its accounts to Election Commission. It doesn't have to pay tax on it. All it has to show is receipts and expenditure. These statistics, which Vikram quoted, actually emerged in December, when the Election Commission deregistered some 100, 200 political parties for not contesting election. So there are about 1,000 political parties which are registered and which are claiming these tax exemptions, as I said, that your income is non-taxable as long as you produce some set of accounts. They are apparently clearly money laundering operations. I set up a political party, I get it registered by Election Commission, and I use that political party to launder my black into white, and perhaps, so that is what has been happening, and the Election Commission has done a first step in deregistrating, but only about 100, 200. There are still 1,000 parties, like organizations, which are doing this.
But has demonetization affected that process?
Well, I doubt it, because as I keep saying, in the UP elections, when demonetization was first announced, there were various theories going around, and one was that it was meant to weaken the opposition in the UP elections, that with this, Mayawati won't have cash, Samajwadi party won't have cash, and the Congress party, what little it has, it would have been demonetized. But we saw in the election campaign that there seemed to be no dearth of money among any of the parties. So clearly demonetization didn't empty the political parties' coffers.
I move to another sensitive chapter in your book on the impact on Reserve Bank of India. The anecdotal evidence which we have is that the reputation of Reserve Bank of India has been dented. Our former governor has also mentioned it. Raghuram Rajan is strangely silent. Of course, I think tactically it's the right thing to do. And I want you to give your opinion on the issue of independence. Has this demonetization process truly proved that RBI is subservient to the government, or does it continue to be a premier central bank in the world?
Yeah, there's no two ways about it that its reputation has been affected, you know. The question is whether it can retrieve its reputation over the years. That having said that, let me, you know, there's one thing actually which was not, again, there's an undercurrent in the book, but I'd like to say it more forcefully here. The issue of autonomy is not so much, I mean, that was actually pathetic that the rules which the RBI was supposed to frame and announce, we saw in the night the finance ministry announcing it, and the next day RBI issuing circulars. And then we had that story about the Central Board of the Reserve Bank meeting 2 hours before the Prime Minister's speech. All that is bad enough. But there is one important issue that, you know, currency management, currency issues are the preserve of the Reserve Bank. They have to issue currency, manage currency, etc. Black money is not their preserve, okay? Dealing with counterfeit currency is. But here you had a situation where the government, which had its job, you know, to deal with black money, in a way using the RBI through the demonetization route to hit not only counterfeit currency as it said, but also black money. So this is the infringement of autonomy, which for me is most important, that you have, by law, you have said that this is your area. I have nothing to do with issuing cash, distributing cash, what currencies, etc. And yet, to achieve my ends, or so-called my ends, I make you undertake this. You know, that is the biggest, I think, breaching of the autonomy. Now, it depends, you know, how over the years it will be able to recover its autonomy. Fortunately, it's still a highly professional organization. If you remember, in 1975-76, a governor was appointed at the behest of Sanjay Gandhi during the emergency, who knew nothing about central banking. He was there just to see that Maruti at that time, you know, which you know belonged to Sanjay Gandhi, got money. So RBI was directing banks to give money to Maruti. But the point I'm trying to make is that he was removed, and within a year or so, the Reserve Bank recovered. So I just hope that this one institution that we have will be able to recover its strength and autonomy.
The other aspect of involvement of Reserve Bank is still a mystery, because we don't know how much money is finally going to be as a surplus money on its balance sheet. So you discuss in this whether this should be given as a special dividend, this should be added to the reserves, or this should be remonetized. If you were the RBI governor, what would you do?
If I were the RBI governor and if I had the power in my hands, I would keep it in my reserves to strengthen the reserves of the RBI, especially because, as I mentioned in the table out there, over the past few years, I made a mistake. All my surpluses I have given to the government. That was a mistake I made. So now and therefore to that extent, my reserves position has got weakened. So I can try and make amends by holding on to what little has not come back to the banking system. But now you're pushing me to cross certain lines. But given that I was so weak in the past few years and given away whatever surpluses I had, which incidentally I did for the first time, you know, before I think 2011 or 12, nothing like that had happened. Given my weakness over those years, I don't know if I'll be strong enough to hold on to this money.
No, I would like to bring your attention to, if I remember right, section 47 of the RBI Act, which says that after making provisions for the usual and necessary expenditure which are normally made in the ordinary course of business of banking, the Reserve Bank of India shall transfer its entire surplus to the Government of India. That is what that section says. And there has been a debate much earlier as to whether RBI even has a right to withhold this money, because it is largely the money it is making out of government securities. Uh, in that context, I think in the last 3 years, as a consequence of that debate, is why the previous governor gave the entire money to the reserve, to the Government of India. I don't think, and I agree with that concept that RBI cannot hold back its reserve, and it should go back to the government, because it is managing the government securities. I have a different question now. The money in circulation is largely backed, is not largely, is entirely backed by foreign securities, not by Government of India securities. Every rupee given printed in India is backed by foreign securities. Now, if you save that kind of liability, shouldn't we make adjustment in our foreign securities and repay some of our foreign debt?
Perhaps Vikram, I mean, this is slightly straying into a territory which I'm not that familiar with, but you know, what you're saying does make sense, you know, on a common sense level, given that our money supply is now backed by foreign securities. Any reduction in liabilities should be met by a reduction in foreign securities as well.
I have a last question before we make it open. Do you think that this process of demonetization has opened an era of tax harassment? You mentioned that in the book.
Yeah, actually, that is my one big fear, that we are now, you see what has happened, we don't know the exact figures, but a lot of the money has come in. We have an amnesty scheme. As of now, just a few thousand crores have been disclosed in amnesty, and this is in comparison to some 3 or 4 lakh crores that we expected to discover as black money. So not much, I think, will come by way of amnesty. So the next thing is, the income tax persons have to find out how much of those deposits were of illegal money, which opens, I think, the door for tax harassment. The biggest fear is that this is now, because the government has to prove that what it did was a major success, it will give carte blanche to the tax authorities to go after the so-called, I mean, crooked. But the crooked know how to manage the system. Okay, so it is really the honest or the small crooks who will get affected, and it really is, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, that our concern should be now, I think I have a section there called return of the taxman, you know. Is this what is going to happen now, you know? Is that going to be the one concrete outcome of demonetization, is a lot of powers to tax authorities and harassment?
Would you like to tell us if there were any specific differences in your and Dr. Reddy's approach to the issue?
About my view, I thought in the answers to Vikram's questions, it came out fairly clear that I don't think it was a good decision. My biggest concern post UP polls, etc., is that it seems to have been more a political decision than an economic policy decision with a political risk. That is what worries me, that, you know, a government can take such a decision on those reasons. You know? So that's where I stand. Now, specifically with Dr. Reddy, you know, I must say, you know, I learned a lot from him in many respects, but especially in how to change your opinion when the facts change. As I said, you know, we started at this part. I think he moved much more than I did, you know, and he was willing to, you know, when he saw, you know, initially when it happened, He had just given a speech on black money and, you know, what needs to be done. And then he thought, he didn't think it was a good thing, but he thought it was a shock to the system, which showed the government, you know, determined to do something. But then over time, as he saw the impact on the ground and, you know, and what was happening and what must have been apparent to the government before it took that decision, he changed his view. So therefore he moved, you know, much more than I did. I also moved, but I think I must acknowledge here that, I mean, that's one of the things I learned from him, that when the facts change, you should change your view as well.
Good evening, sir. I'm a little confused. I recognize my knowledge about economics is near zero. I'd like to read you and whoever can explain me what's going on in India. It's my third demonetization in different countries. I get my own theory about the way we recapitalize the Indian banks with our own money, and now they want to punish us to move it in and out. And yesterday, you've been talking about black money, political parties. If the demonetization officially, the excuse was the black money, yesterday the finance bill was changed, allowing the companies, the firms, and we know who they are, unlimited donations to the political parties without disclose the quantities, neither the names. I go to the bank, and it's a history in between the PAN card, the Adan card, blah, blah. You say, okay, listen, forget me. But now, the companies can give unlimited donations. It's like open the door for the black money again, no?
It is about the recent amendments. Yeah, go ahead.
Again, you hit the nail on the head. There are two things. One, removing the ceiling. You see, actually, I think until about 25 years ago, companies were not allowed to make donations. The rules have been changed over time, you know. About 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was 5% of their profits. Then it became 7.5% of the profits. If you remove the ceiling as they have done now, it's not so much black money as it allows companies to have a greater say in the affairs of political parties. You know, the richer companies who can, who want, you know, certain contracts, certain decisions changed, will obviously fund certain political parties more than they were earlier. So really, it is the influence of money power in politics that is going to go up with this removal of this risk. So that is, you know, this is a good example of how what the government has been saying about dealing with black money, corruption, etc., doesn't gel with some of the things it does. And now that you've spoken about it, there was another measure in the budget about electoral bonds. I won't get into the details. I discussed that briefly in the book. Instead of transparency, those new electoral bonds that I've introduced are actually going to permit anonymity. A company doesn't have to say who it is donated money to with those bonds, and the political party doesn't have to say who it has received it from. So you have this very strange thing, you know, you are talking about demonetization, talking about corruption, cleaning up politics, and at the same time doing exactly the opposite.
The gentleman there.
Yeah, sir. Suppose, what if you have this kind of act of same thing, demonetization, every few years, say every 5 to 8 years, without any date being mentioned in the past? I feel this will try to reduce the money getting kept hoarded. Money hoarding will stop. And probably charity also will become more and more. Without giving the dates, every, say, 5 to 7 years, 5 to 8 years. You just have a, hot surprise on the masses. How it works. How will it work? I mean.
I think before Ram can answer this question, I want to say, if every 5 years you have a demonetization, our ability to stand in queues will improve enormously.
See, at a more serious answer, uh, indirectly I discussed this in the book. You see, currency issue, it's just a piece of paper. The value of the paper is trust. I promise to pay you the value of that. If you are going to break that trust every few years, then the entire basis for commercial transactions, forget commercial transactions, any kind of transactions between individuals involving cash will break down. Because, see, that's one of the things with this decision. It suddenly, this thing was thrust on us, and, where is the faith in the system that this currency, I mean, my cash that I had was legal. What the other person may have had was illegal, but in one swell swoop, everybody's currency was affected. So you're breaking that trust. So that one of the fundamental bases on which cash functions, you are weakening with demonetization on this scale. And if you were to do it every few years, then I think we will have a breakdown in society. I mean, you won't have to stand in queues because we'll be busy fighting with each other.
For example, we know where the black money is getting generated. When we go to any sub-registrar office, we value our sales at 1/5 of the rate to avoid stamp duty. And this is known to everyone. And when we go to film industry, we know how much black money prevails there. So everywhere we see every day in and day out how the black money is active in the market. The other day, I went to Chevella. I found the farmer was getting 3 rupees per kg for tomato. When I came to Hyderabad, it was being sold at 15 rupees per kg. Chevella is hardly 30 kilometers from here. The transport and what we call intermediary charges has boosted up so much. And this 12 rupees, out of 12, at least 10 will be only getting into black channel. Knowing all these things, having eyes to see and ears to listen, we have followed a method which is known as the last resort of a total exercises having failed. I have not read your book, but the way you are trying to be cautious in not openly spelling out the things and not to be rude like me, because any expert would not like to be as rude as a layman like me. So I would like to say why we are going around beating around the bush. And just now you said, only yesterday, Arun Jaitley made a statement about electoral reforms. And there he rightly, as rightly said by you, neither the man who is donating is known to anyone, nor the man who is receiving is known to anyone. And if this is electoral reform which is going to make things smoother or make black money not to play role and make honest citizens to enter into political life, I think we are just fooling ourselves, and this fooling of people is done for last 7 decades, and if it should not be done year after, at least at a forum like this, intellectual forums, we should be bold enough to say what is wrong, and what is right. Thank you, sir.
It is wrong. I mean, there are no two ways about it. I fully agree with you that it was a completely wrong decision. But as I said, the book is written in a certain way so that, we are too much in thrall of experts and others who tell us what is right and wrong. So here, the book is written in a way so that each one of the readers becomes an expert in his or her own right, so that he can come to a certain decision. I mean, there is no ambiguity about where I stand or what I feel.
Can you please clarify what you meant when you said, as of today, every rupee in circulation is backed by foreign securities? Can you explain a little in detail?
In the RBI balance sheet is divided into what is known as the issue department and the banking department. In the issue department, on the liability side, we have notes in circulation. On the asset side, you have foreign securities. Earlier, till about 10 years ago, it was a mix of Government of India securities and foreign securities. 30 years ago, it was only Government of India securities. Now, every note printed today is backed by a corresponding asset, which is real. So you don't have to think that RBI is printing notes for the government. It's not like that. They followed a conservative approach. That is, thanks to the increasing foreign exchange reserves we have, every note in circulation is backed by a foreign security.
Can I explain the same thing? You see, when the country earns foreign exchange, either exports or foreign investment comes in, it comes in as dollars or yen or euro. Okay. Now, that is converted into rupees. Okay. So, for every increase in foreign exchange that the country earns or receives, there is an increase in rupees. Okay, rupees. Okay, that is put out. And that foreign exchange that the government gets, it doesn't keep it in, the RBI gets, it doesn't keep it in its accounts as dollars, etc. It invests it in foreign security, US treasuries, Japanese securities, etc. That's what he's saying, that because of the huge amount of foreign exchange that has come into the country over the past 10 years, that is what has been driving currency in the economy. And you know, you have to earn something from that foreign exchange, so you invest it in securities.
Sir, I have two questions for you. First thing, whether this economy can survive without black money, because everywhere black money is there. Whether the economy can survive without black money, one question. The second question is, we are having a democratic political system and parliamentary governance system. The decision taken on demonetization on 8th November was purely individual decision of Mr. Narendra Modi. Whether a single individual can have hold such much of power in a democratic country to destabilize the entire economy and society.
Yeah, two interesting questions. One, you see, black money is everywhere, but it doesn't mean that if you're, you know, how do I explain? You know, it is, you're not removing black money, but you're removing the way in which, or the forms in which black money is generated. Okay. So, you know, if you do that, then the economy will become cleaner. So it's not as if there is a black economy and the white economy, that if you knock off the black economy, the whole economy will collapse. It's not like the two are actually mixed. They're together. You know, there's a black in the white and there's white in the black. So what we have to do is work towards removing the scope and sources of generation of black money, so that things become cleaner. Like I was talking about stamp duty. You know, if you reduce the rate of stamp duty, maybe there will be less evasion, okay, and less black money will be generated there. So if you have better tax administration without harassment, so maybe there will be less tax evasion and less black money generated there. So it's not as if we can do without it. The second more interesting and important question, yes, it is a very dangerous thing that a single person took such a decision. You see, in 1978, when demonetization was done, it was done differently. It was done through an act of parliament. Okay, it was not done individually. Here they did it, made the RBI recommend it so that one person or a so-called cabinet could do it. And that is a very, I mean, that's what, you know, I said, that a decision taken secretly, a decision taken for purely political ends, and decision taken by 1 or 2 or 3 persons, it augurs very, it really very bad for our democracy and of our future. That one worry should be not whether there's a demonetization round the corner in 2 years from time, but will there be something like this, you know, something as autocratic, as, you know, sweeping as this, you know.
Sir, first thing, earlier when the demonetization is announced, we slept at 2 o'clock. We are discussing how the India is going to develop with this demonetization drive, how we are going to affect. But as long as the time passed on, I realized that I lost my freedom, I lost my fundamental rights. See, Constitution guarantees some certain fundamental rights which can't be taken by the state except in emergency situation. See, Constitution guarantees me right to move across the country. with money only, I can move across the country. See, the government has taken away my freedom, freedom to move across the country, right? And one more thing, it also violates my right to life, because suddenly my father or somebody got heart attack. If I take him to any private hospital on November 8th or November 9th, and at that time, so we were unable to pay the money. If the doctors or the management of the hospital is very greedy with money, if they couldn't handle the people, so that's why can't we sue the government? Because it literally it taken away my freedoms, right? Money is a thing from which only I can exercise all my freedoms, and few of my freedoms, right? Freedom of rights, fundamental rights. So is it right to sue the government because it has taken away rights of mine?
No, I fully agree with you that in a sense there was a breaching of violation of one's fundamental rights. You know, I talk about movement, one's occupation. You can think of so many different right to livelihood, you know, all of that was violated by that measure. But legally, you know, the law, it's not an ass, but, you know, the courts look at things very narrowly. And it looks like, you know, it was discussed in the, I mean, there's a petition in the Supreme Court. Their view seems not to look at it, you know, as a violation. But in common sense terms, it very much was. But having said that, you know, what we should think about is, why is it that more people are not thinking like you and me? You know, why are we not angry about it, you know? And that's where I spoke about that it was projected as a war against a crooked, you know, for which we were willing to put up with inconvenience as it was caused. So while that inconvenience went on for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, even now in Telangana, there's very little cash in the ATMs. I don't know. It's a big mystery. You know, I mean, there's one chapter which I call demonetization and unfolding story. So I don't think the story has ended yet. So how people are going to react, you know, what they're willing to accept, it is a mystery to me. You know, why there has been so little of protest. Essentially because they were able to, I mean, they were convinced by the political argument given by the government.
Sir, I'm Thomas. They did something, but now in the recent news we are seeing that some result is going to come. 18 lakh accounts are under scanner. 10 lakh accounts are going to be scrutinized. But one of the brothers says, can we remove black money? I will say no. In the Arthashastra, he mentions manifestations of frauds happening. So it will exist always in some form or the other. What about other form of black money? When are they going to do anything about it?
Yeah, just the last question. I don't know, because one of the, you know, initially when demonetization was announced, there was a lot of criticism. Then the Prime Minister himself and the government said, no, this is only the first of many measures, you know. And 3 months later, you know, one is still waiting for those other measures. There have been some small things here and there that have been done. But big things, which again, briefly I've discussed in the last chapter, they're nowhere in sight. So that again comes back to what was this all about. And that 18 lakh accounts, yes, you know, they have been making inquiries, queries, etc. But, you know, I would like to see what comes out of that, you know, because, yeah, well, hopefully, but I am not hopeful, but hopefully, yes, if it does, yeah.
State Bank of India has got an office, Chief Economic Advisors. They come out with one report every month on economy. It's called Eco Watch Report. 9 months before demonetization, which is in March 2016, in page 8, they unequivocally mentioned that there are unconfirmed sources that demonetization of the higher notes is going to happen. And that's why there is a surge of thousands of crores of deposits in the bank. And also there is a surge in buying jewelry. They use demonetization word also in that. Page 8, March EcoWatch report. And another thing, I know of two cases where two engineering colleges owned by very elite people in which my relatives work. They were paid, usually they get paid in the bank, but on 5 days before demonetization, they were paid 5 months salary in advance in 500,000 notes. So these are three things. And another thing is, somewhere in December, Mr. K.V. Kamath, ICICI ex-chairman, very clearly said that demonetization serves the recapitalization problem. This is the best solution, he said. So what is the link? Could you please tell me? Thank you.
I can't, you know, I've seen that SBI report. I think I would like to read it again, but I don't think it was so unambiguous as you mentioned, but I would like to read it again. Some of those other examples, you know, there have been talks that some people put in more money, etc. You know, I think we need to do more analysis. I don't, you know, I don't see how, you see, money comes into banks, extra money. I don't see how that is a recapitalization. That is actually a liability of the banks. The bank owes the person who deposited the money. What demonetization has done is has made banks flush with funds which they can lend, but it has not solved their recapitalization problem. That argument was made a lot at that time that it was being done for this reason, etc. I don't agree with that. The true extent to which some people knew in advance, I don't know. Maybe we'll have to wait for some more research to come to a conclusion whether there were some political parties and some others who knew.
Good evening, sir. Only one question of mine here. We have found the black money which is hoarded in India. Do you think that the Swiss money which we are talking, it's a myth, or does it really exist? I didn't get it. I'm asking that is that Swiss black money which they are talking is a myth, or is it for real?
You want to answer it or you want me to answer? Yeah, you are. Swiss money is not a myth. There is real money in Swiss banks. First, I want to clarify that. The money held by Indian citizens or non-resident Indians who have laundered that money out of India and put it in Swiss banks is real. It's not a myth. How much is it? Nobody knows. So when someone promises that he can get that money back, it's a very, very tall order, because there are laws in India, laws in Switzerland, which are not in consonance with each other. In India, till very recently, tax evasion is not a crime under the Money Laundering Act. So Switzerland always said that you cannot ask me to send, even consider your request when in your own country, tax evasion is not a money laundering crime. That I just want to bring that into the thing. And the second thing is, it's all very, very difficult. If suppose a non-resident Indian, let us say Lakshmi Mittal, I'm just giving an example, he holds an Indian passport even today, and he sells his factory in Ukraine and deposits that in a Swiss bank. He has no obligation to send that money to India. But the Swiss bank doesn't keep calculating whether this is money laundered from India just because it's an Indian passport holder. So these are very, very difficult questions, and that money is not ever going to come back.
Ram, from what you said, I seem to understand that the Prime Minister knew or he could easily have guessed, and he would have guessed the kind of difficulties people will go through, possibly the ineffectiveness of this, and it became an entirely political decision. So this underlies a presupposition that he knew that it would pay off. You think he would have known that it would pay off? Because I don't think anyone really was able to speculate that, or we heard about it.
I mean, you know, if you asked me this question 1 month ago, I wouldn't have given you this answer, but it seems to me now that it was a political gamble that he took. which paid off. If you recall the first month or so, there was some nervousness in the government's response. Even in Uttar Pradesh elections, it was the opposition which made demonetization an issue. The BJP wasn't, because it was not sure. But it has paid off. So if that has paid off, then is there more to come? I don't know, one can only hope that being in a strong position, the government will not think that it needs to do something like this, in a year or two down the line. Because that is something that is really worrying, that you can take a decision like this when you knew it was going to hurt people, it was going to hurt so badly. I would be slightly more charitable and say that maybe they felt, I keep saying they, because they felt that something would come out of it, but let's leave this aside. But you knew that it was going to hurt people, and yet you did it. So it was clearly a very hurtful political decision. I mean, the fact that it paid off doesn't validate the decision.
But it required immense courage.
Sir, revered guest and Mr. Gandhi and lot of others, you are keeping on saying that it is kept as a secret and only Prime Minister regarding the difficulties from the next day morning, 10th morning. But the fact is, at 8 p.m. when he announced, he said there will be difficulties, initial difficulties. At 10:30 and 11 through AIR, All India Radio, he explained, he talked to the nation. There also he said, कठिनाई होंगे, मगर वो it is only transition phase में there will be problems. He specifically told and said, परसों दिवाली का कचरा हटा है, अभी देश का कचरा हटाने का है. उसके लिए मैं समझता हूँ कि मेरे citizens तैयार है. You can play the what do you call the old file, I mean that audio this thing. So it is not that he unambiguously said that there will be difficulties initially.
Hi, sir. I came in a bit late and I wasn't. Hi, sorry. I'll just. Sorry. The question. Hello. You hear me? Hi. My bigger question here is that today, in terms of like, let's say when you have a product, it's not really important what the product does, but how the product is perceived. That is what is really a part of a marketing philosophy in a very rough manner, so to say. So from that perspective, would you say today marketing communication coupled with a skewed narrative, the marriage of these both, is this more of a primary requirement as compared to the logic of the execution? Like today, would you say that this is what is the philosophy of the day in terms of when you talk about such landmark policies? Secondly, as a follow-up to this, historically, we've seen every other political party implementing whatever policy. Everybody markets it in some way or the other. Everybody sugarcoats it in some way or the other. But what is this party doing so effectively that today, maybe because of that, we are not angry. Maybe we are not angry because something in the marketing communication is far more effective than what logic truly spells out. What would you?
I didn't quite get your first question, but on the second, I don't really have an answer, about I really don't know. I mean, what it is. I mean, we can ex post say that there are certain narratives which have appealed, certain narratives which have not appealed, etc. I don't really would, want to get into, the marketing approaches and,
Sir, one small question is there. Cashless transaction is very good from government point of or anybody's point of view. Cashless transaction. Even then, what we find in between the given and taker, a kind of unsympathetic approach. How to do away with this? What is your opinion? See, in the market, cashless transactions going on. Officially it is correct. But if you think practically, there is a difference of unsympathetic way of dealing with it between the given and taker. How to cut it off, this kind of unsympathetic way of transaction? They don't accept the cashless transaction in general market. How to do away with it?
Cashless is something that is far off. We are not ready for that yet. And the interesting thing is that during those 2 months, because there was no cash, there was a lot of push to digital transactions. A lot of that went up. But after that, as cash has come back into the market, the digital transactions have come down. So it just shows that you can't do things by compulsion. It has to be. There are various steps necessary to move towards digitalization. So I don't think we are there yet. We can't rush with that process.
More a comment than a question. Just want to emphasize something which you said. What is really worrying is what has happened and its consequences have really not given rise to protest. And as a sociologist, I think we should now be looking at the consequences of it, which has been extremely, it has taken away livelihoods. It has rendered lakhs and lakhs of people, as you said, in the unorganized sector. The middle class has managed somehow, maybe lost something, but managed to continue their everyday lives without major losses. But the poor, who are so busy now somehow, continuing to find a way of carrying on, are busy with that. So for me, this question remains that one crisis after another comes and there is very little protest. Why does that happen? We've got used to it. We somehow manage situations and carry on. And I think in the absence of any organization, really it is extremely worrying. And you have, of course, touched upon it. I just wanted to bring it to the audience.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you whether we are not underestimating the use of propaganda, which is used so effectively and with such sophistication that the fallout of demonetization may have been minimized as a result of the way media and the entire propaganda machine was mounted.
I don't think so, Bizek, because the impact that people felt was real. I mean, no amount of propaganda could have neutralized that, over a sustained period. People felt that, but they were yet willing to put up with it, over extended period. The question that, we should ask ourselves is like what Professor Indra Munshi raised, that what is it that they were willing to accept in spite of having to go through so much difficulties, and in spite of seeing that those who were the targets were getting away. You know, it's not as if the story that was told was that the crooks were going to get caught. But the crooks were not getting caught. The ones who were getting caught were ordinary people who had legal money. And yet they were willing to accept that and accepted that narrative over extended periods. So I don't know whether, you know, propaganda can have that kind of effect over a sustained period. I don't know. I mean, you know.